a lot of the oligarchs that run Silicon Valley have switched sides.
How serious do you take these weird niche political ideologies that crop up?
Well, unfortunately, I think we have to take them a lot more seriously because that Overton window really is shifting. People are abandoning liberalism, but the main problem is that I don't see any consistent alternative. Cancel culture, it exists. I've seen examples of it. I have friends that have been affected by it, but that's not living under Stalin's, Soviet Union.
What do you envision that the Democrats could offer in 2028?
Ah, good. All right. I was waiting for that
I've
question.
been working up to it. Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Francis Fukuyama, a scholar and political scientist. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. He is a council member of the International Forum for Democratic Studies, founded by the National Endowment for Democracy, and he was a member of the Political Science Department of the RAND Corporation. He is the chair of the editorial board for American Purpose. Francis Fukuyama is the author of many books. He is most well known for his 1992 work, The End of History and The Last Man. Drawing on Hegel and Marx, he explores the concept of teleology, the idea that history is a linear process where human societies progress through sequential socioeconomic forms. As Marx famously wrote, feudalism was replaced by capitalism and would ultimately be replaced by socialism. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama argued that Western liberal democracy was the final form of human government. His thesis has been updated and revised many times since and remains a subject of debate up to today. He is considered by many to be the most influential political scientist of the late 20th century. You mentioned 2008 before. What is the chain of events that you see leading to the rise of Donald Trump?
Well, there's actually two things that moved me to the left and that I think moved Donald Trump further to the right. So the first was the Iraq War, and the second was the financial crisis, right, in 2003 and then in 2008. For me, the Iraq War demonstrated the bankruptcy of certain conservative ideas. So the Iraq War, all my former neocon friends, believed that you could use hard military power to reshape the politics of an entire region that was culturally very different, that we didn't really understand. And that turned out to be a big mistake. But then the financial crisis, demonstrated that this neoliberal model where you deregulate everything didn't work. Now, I strongly believe that there's a lot of parts of the American economy that do need to be deregulated, but the financial sector is not one of them. In fact, what the crisis demonstrated is if you don't regulate these guys up the wazoo, you're going to end up, in big trouble. My reaction to that is, you got to re-regulate certain parts of the economy, and you should stay out of stupid wars. I think that the consequence was a backlash because both of those things hurt ordinary people, right? Especially the financial crisis. So millions of Americans lost their homes because of the subprime, meltdown.
Yes.
And people were resentful because the Wall Street types that had really engineered that crash, they suffered a little bit for about a year, and then they're back to, their old billions of dollars in assets. And I think that's created long-term, shockwaves that we're still feeling to this day.
Huge contributions to the rise of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
There's a staggering statistic, I think this is from 2016, that the single greatest data point that is a predictor of whether a household went for Trump or for Clinton in that election was if they had a family member or knew someone who died in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. We're in a strange situation now where Trump has won the popular vote. And previous to that, there was what many people have described, yourself included, as an insurrection at the Capitol. What does this mean for the current order, that we have both insurrection and then the popular victory?
It means that I think we're in for a much deeper disruption of our system than anyone thought. I mean, this is the transition that I've had trouble making, and a lot of people have had because you tend to think about, party politics in the United States. So liberals want this and conservatives want that. And, kind of one wants higher tax rates, the other one wants lower tax rates, and that's kind of the outer limits of the debate. And I think today those limits, that Overton window has really shifted in much more dramatic direction. So I think on the left, there are things that are going to be on the table that weren't on the table before, but especially on the right, you're going to bring back a lot of ideas that, had been excluded under the old liberal order.
In 2025, can we say that there is a broad historical trend towards liberal democracy?
I think that the broad trend exhausted itself by about 2008. So this is what Samuel Huntington once labeled the third wave of democratization. It started with Spain and Portugal in the early 1970s. It kind of peaked with the collapse of communism. And then it's been downhill ever since about 2008. So there's been this big recession in democratization. It doesn't mean it's not going to start again. So the real question is this like a market correction where you've got this long-term trend towards democracy, or is it going to be replaced by something else? And are we kind of permanently, in this sort of recession or even depression? And, that's an open question.
Moving to the left, you've described yourself as something of a social democrat nowadays.
If you have a capitalist or market economy, you're going to get inequalities. And if you don't regulate it carefully, first, you're going to get instability. So that's what we saw with the financial crisis. But secondly, you're going to get an increasingly skewed distribution of income and wealth. And therefore, you've got to do things to take the edges off of that. You can't eliminate those inequalities, but you can certainly mitigate them. The most sensible way to start is the way almost all countries started, Social Security and healthcare. We were very late in healthcare. Every other modern democracy had some form of universal guaranteed access to healthcare decades before the United States. Clinton tried it in the 90s, it failed. Obama didn't get to it until 2010 with the Affordable Care Act. And even then, the Republicans spent the next decade trying to dismantle that. So it's been an uphill struggle, but I think that it's really important to have at least those two elements. Now, there are other forms of income redistribution. We actually do something that the Europeans don't do to equalize outcomes. We have a highly progressive income tax, whereas they raise most of their revenues through a value-added tax, which is actually more regressive because everybody pays a value-added tax, whereas only high-income earners, have these high marginal tax rates. So, we do things like that to equalize outcomes. And I just think if you look at the history of modern democracies, if you don't do something to redistribute income, you're going to end up with a huge populist backlash. And that's why I think some form of, social democracy is necessary to stabilize a capitalist economic system.
Do you have a preferred solution for the crisis of American healthcare?
No. I mean, that's such a tough problem because in a way we have the worst of all worlds. We have both socialized medicine and free market medicine, but we have them in all the wrong places, and so this fee-for-service model that most doctors operate under is crazy. They will prescribe every conceivable test, you get a runny nose and they'll tell you, oh no, you have to have a CAT scan, an MRI, and this sort of thing. And it's just driven by this crazy system of incentives that we've implemented in this country. And so, I don't have a solution to this, but I think there are sensible things that could be done to make this thing work better.
On this topic of inequality, there's a proposal from people like Peter Thiel to build freedom cities, quote unquote, special economic zones inside the U.S. Do you see this as a political possibility in the 21st century?
No, in fact, they tried to do this in Honduras or...
yes, it exists.
Yeah.
What is the name of it? Prospera.
Yeah. That just strikes me as a rich elite trying to ignore the problem by creating a kind of Disneyland for you and your family where, you can get away from all the problems that actually afflict, the rest of the society. And I just don't think that that's a very just, outcome. I mean, in a way, we've done that already, with suburbanization and, suburbs wanting to pull away from their inner city cores, this sort of thing. And I just don't think that that's a fair, way of solving these social problems.
Your background, your research into the process of state formation, how seriously do you take any of these libertarian exit projects, building these private city-states, network states, so to speak?
Well, I don't think that they quite understand, the imperatives that stand behind states and particularly behind effective states, because, really what makes a state good is a lot of capacity and a lot of authority behind that capacity, and then the constraints that operate to make sure that that power is not misused. And I just think that most libertarians don't think in those terms. They want the freedom part, but they don't want the state capacity part. They don't want governments that are actually capable of doing things that benefit the broader society. And that's why I think most of these projects are really not going to work.
It strikes me that the complete irrationality of Doge is, I mean, this is like what we would do to a country that we colonized, implementing Chicago
or didn't
school
like
austerity.
very much. Yeah,
it really is wild. So we won't have Shenzhen at home.
Well, you think about it. What organization, if you simply went and fired a random 20% of their employees, would function well after that, without any thought to which 20% you're getting rid of? I mean, it's a crazy, I mean, it makes you think the real intention is actually not efficiency, it's just destruction.
A few years ago, you were famously quoted as saying that socialism should come back. In what ways should socialism come back?
Well, I mean, in exactly the way that I mentioned, I think that you need more state intervention to equalize outcomes. And, that means things like actually having a real effective, affordable, universal healthcare system. It means shoring up your pension system so it's not going to go bankrupt. Properly speaking, that's social democracy and not socialism, because I think socialism implies ownership of all the productive assets, and I don't think that's a good solution. But I do think judicious regulation and provision of certain basic services like healthcare is really necessary.
So we're not talking about capital S socialism coming back in the 21st century. How much of today's political chaos is a result of social media, and how much of it is an underlying real political crisis?
Yeah, that's a really hard one to pin down, because I think both of them are obviously factors. But as time has gone on, I tend to think that actually the technology contribution is more important than I was inclined to think at first. And part of the reason is that, if you listen to the rhetoric coming from, it comes from the left, but especially now from the right, you think that we're living in this absolute hellscape, where there's censorship and tyranny and, people being, forcibly ejected from, certain spheres of, social life. And that just doesn't correspond to anything I've experienced. So for example, cancel culture, it exists. I've seen examples of it. I have friends that have been affected by it, but that's not living under Stalin's, Soviet Union. There's really a difference there. And so the extremeness with which people think that we're in the midst of a social crisis is something that I find hard to explain apart from social media, because what the internet does is it allows you to live in your own bespoke world where, you only see the facts that you want to see, and everything, confirms the biases that you started with. And I think that, that's one of the things that the internet has brought us.
And if it is creating more political instability, what kind of constraints would you be willing to accept on social media?
I chaired a Stanford working group on platform scale back in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And we were trying to address this problem of who is it that should control social media. And it was a big dilemma, because you don't want these big private platforms to be the arbiters of what's true, and what's acceptable speech. But you also don't want the government to do that. The government tried to get into that after 2016, and that's what created this big, revolt on the right, where they claimed that the government was trying to censor them and so forth. And the only solution that we could come up with was something we called middleware, where you would basically take away the mediation function from these big platforms and give it to third parties that would hopefully create a competitive ecosystem of basically, media filters. And you could pick anyone you wanted. So instead of X or Facebook making the decisions through their algorithms as to what you saw, you could pick, what it was you want. I think that was the original vision of the internet, not that everybody would see the same thing regulated by the government, but you'd have a choice in the kind of stuff that you saw online. We put that idea out there. Some people have tried to pick up on it, but there's no business model that we could come up with that supports it. But as far as I can see, that's kind of the only way that you can deal with this problem, that you can simply pick and choose your own ways of filtering the internet. So if you don't want to see a certain, type of material, you can choose not to.
So just to restate this to make sure I understand. So platforms like Twitter or Instagram, things like this exist. We're all users within those different networks, those different stacks. I'm posting, you're posting. But the thing that filters and prioritizes my newsfeed is designed by a third party rather than Meta or X or so on.
And the thing is that when the platform is writing the algorithm, they've got a financial incentive, for virality. They don't care whether it's true. They don't care whether it's good for democracy. They basically want to get as much user engagement as possible. And that's one of the things that's fed the current, crisis. And so if you take that power away from them and give it to the users themselves, our view was that would at least, it wouldn't get rid of the problem of compartmentalization, and filter bubbles, but it would take this big power away from the platforms, to determine what it was that their users saw.
Yeah. So this think tank in 2020, I've heard people propose similar things before. I think what may happen in the near future, the platforms are already working on these type of filters that basically you're going to have a dial that goes between left and right and between outrageous and boring. And you're going to prioritize it for your own, whatever preferences. But there's no third-party accountability in that model, and that's what they would prefer.
I mean, having at least that degree of choice would be an improvement over what happens now, where you've got these completely untransparent algorithms. So, whatever degree of control you can insert would be a good thing, but I don't think you can trust the platforms ultimately to be the ones that provide those controls, because they're still going to be looking to their bottom lines and what's, most profitable for them. And that's why giving it to a third party, I think, is still a much preferable route to take.
How important are memes in shaping political discourse?
I should be asking you that. I think...
you wrote a great piece recently about the material basis of changing gender relations, about these Elon Musk and Trump are in the sweatshop factories putting together, they're stitching clothes or something.
Yeah, no, I think that's the way people communicate these days. It's, through these little snippets of ideas rather than whole coherent ideas. And I think it's pretty important. There's also, I think, a huge generational difference because people in my generation don't think that way.
You are, though, very literate in these things, comparatively speaking. For most people I talk to, you're more aware of them. I wonder also if there's some level of your work and the breadth of the Overton window in what you write about and research that fits with social media, so that you have some level of awareness before these memes even crop up. Like there was a candidate a few years ago that ran for the Transhumanist Party. This is something you've written about a lot. And if you don't know the kind of background of that philosophy, you might assume it's like a novelty of social media, but there actually is, many years of people working towards these goals, particularly from the libertarian camp.
Yeah.
How serious do you take these weird niche political ideologies that crop up?
Well, unfortunately, I think we have to take them a lot more seriously because that Overton window really is shifting, quite rapidly.
Yeah.
And stuff that seemed really unacceptable previously, like just overt racism, is now creeping back into discourse. And so, if you don't pay attention to it, it's going to hit you over the head.
Maybe Doge is the preeminent example of this. It
Yeah.
literally was a meme and is now policy. There's been a drift on the libertarian on the right in the last few years, people moving from this techno-libertarianism to a kind of national conservatism that's very infused with this new right mimetic language. Do you think these people are for real, or are they a kind of hallucination of social media dynamics?
Well, so there's several parts to that, or several parts to an answer. So it is really the case that a lot of the oligarchs that run Silicon Valley have switched sides.
Yeah.
Right? They used to be social liberals, and now they've signed up with Trump and MAGA and so forth. And there's only a handful of them, but they're really important because they got a lot of money and they've got a lot of influence. They got a lot of followers. All the Thiels and Andreessens and Musks and, so forth. So that part of it is right. I guess the part that I'm less aware of is so these are the generals and the commanders. I'm not sure the army beneath them, how much of that is following them or not. And I think that's, really going to determine their ultimate, effectiveness. And the thing is that they've kind of gotten into bed with people that they don't really agree with on a lot of things. It turns out that
Who are you thinking of?
well, I mean, this fight that emerged between Musk and Ramaswamy and also Steve Bannon, they are really international. I mean, the oligarchs are internationalists in terms of talent and who to hire and this sort of thing, and the real Trump base is not.
You mentioned Lina Khan before. Do you take Steve Bannon at his word for this anti-monopoly stuff?
Well, it's not Steve Bannon, it's J.D. Vance. He actually is very much in favor of that whole antitrust line, and he's, I was about to say more thoughtful than Bannon. I'm not sure that that's actually true, but it's very interesting. So essentially, everybody that worked in the Biden administration has become enemy number one to the Trump people, except for Lina Khan.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And that's another point of tension between the tech oligarchs and this administration, because I know a lot of them really soured on the Democratic Party and on Joe Biden because of Lina Khan.
Yeah.
They really didn't like her moving against their companies and preventing them from, buying startups and this sort of thing.
Yep.
But Trump is doing the same thing.
Did Trump end neoliberalism?
No, neoliberalism ended long before Trump.
When did it end?
Well, it ended in the financial crisis, really.
2008.
I think that it was these neoliberal free market principles that led to the financial crisis. And everybody at that point began to realize, if the state doesn't step in and regulate, you're going to have more of these crises. And so the move away from neoliberalism, I think, really began there. That's the point also, that people were really aware of the increasing inequality in the United States in terms of income and wealth, and that was also going to become politically destabilizing. And then, you had a big academic literature about the effect of, China's entry into the WTO and the way that globalization, this is one of these kind of, in retrospect, very annoying things because, when I taught at SAIS at Johns Hopkins, we indoctrinated everybody into free trade, liberal economics, that was the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, all of the economists said, well, okay, so not everybody is better off under a free trade system. Some workers lose out, their jobs go to Mexico or China.
Manufacturing.
Yeah, manufacturing. But we can always compensate them. We can retrain them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that never happened.
Right.
And that's why I think people are legitimately angry about, the results of free trade. And I think I don't know of very many economists that won't admit now that was a really big problem.
Right.
that they had been advocates for a kind of ruthless kind of free trade that made a lot of empty promises to the workers that were going to be hurt by it. And the society never, followed through on those promises. And so I think that process started really a lot earlier than Donald Trump.
So I find that very interesting because the theoretical proofs, the scholarship at the time, said that if we move manufacturing elsewhere, maybe American wages go down, but the goods get so cheap that everyone's living standards go up.
Yeah.
Right? And that was, you run all these theorems, that was the macroeconomic consensus. Was that ever true? Was that a lie? Was that a piece of propaganda?
Well, no, it was obviously true because you had Walmart where you could buy stuff really cheaply and any worker could do that. But, the question, it's more of a value question, I would say, that if the consequence of having all these cheap consumer goods available is that a very significant part of the middle class basically falls into poverty or into opioid, addiction and, all of the social ills that go with this kind of downward social mobility, is that a price that is worth it? Right. And I think a lot of people have decided in retrospect it wasn't, that there's a certain dignity to work, even if it's not the most efficient, even if you could do the same work in another country for a lot less. People still want to have pride in what they do in their communities, and therefore it's legitimate for the government to protect this. And by the way, in different countries, they didn't go in for this kind of neoliberalism to the same extent. So one thing that's very noticeable, if you go to either Japan or France, which are the two countries I think about in this regard, there's a lot of little restaurants, mom and pop shops. There's still a lot of kind of small business retailers. The downtowns haven't emptied out into these big box stores. And this is all deliberate, it was protectionism, because I think that in those societies, people realize that we have a certain way of life and we don't want to disrupt that way of life, even if the Americans have this efficient system where everybody, just goes to Amazon or goes to, Walmart or something. And so I do think that there are alternative ways of, dealing with the social side that reflected, a different set of values that was conservative in the sense that we don't want to disrupt and undermine, our existing society more radically than we have to.
To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon. Is DEI crashing the planes?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that the overt forms of DEI that existed are simply not going to, first of all, they're being criminalized right now, so people aren't going to do it. The more interesting question, I think, is how much of that anti-DEI ideology is actually going to be absorbed by people on the left, or at least in the kind of center left, and become, again, part of the mainstream, because that's the part that's not clear to me. I personally have no problem in theory with affirmative action, because it does seem to me that, people are not just these individuals that are born, out of nothing. I mean, they do reflect the kind of societies they come from, and not everybody is equally advantaged. So I don't think it's terrible for the state to take some role in trying to equalize those outcomes. But I do think that it was taken too far in a lot of circumstances. And especially after George Floyd in 2020, you had extreme forms of it, in terms of defund the police and, Robin DiAngelo and, white fragility. I mean, all these interpretations of DEI that I think were just kind of, at the time I thought they were kind of ridiculous. And that part of it is clearly going to go away. What is both troubling and a more interesting question is how much of it, after the immediate Trump effect is worn off. Let's say you get a Democratic president in 2028 who doesn't enforce this really harsh anti-DEI stuff. How much of it is actually going to remain as a kind of cultural norm that you don't go out of your way to hire an African American or a woman or, someone who's, gay or lesbian, for the, to run your company. That simply just doesn't become the first thought, because I think with a lot of organizations, after 2020, that was the way that they thought.
What kind of effect did those slogans, defund the police, have on the Democratic Party base?
It was terrible. I honestly cannot think of a stupider slogan than defund the police. It's stupid both substantively, because you need the police. You want to reform the police. You don't want to get rid of them. So as a substantive policy matter, it was a really dumb thing. But politically, it was just incredibly harmful because, and actually there's a study that was recently published that turns out the people that were the most in favor of that kind of policy were actually white liberals. That, African Americans, Hispanics, people that lived in these poor communities, that was not something that they liked very much, because they actually needed the police to keep order in their communities, right? And so I think this was, it's something that became trendy among a certain kind of progressive, and it really did a lot to stimulate the opposite, so the anti-DEI movement, in large measure, we have these DEI excesses to thank for.
It's a long time ago now, but as I recall the statistics, the district in which Eric Garner was killed was among the largest shift towards the Republicans around 2020.
Yeah.
How seriously should we take this post-liberalism that comes from the right?
Well, I think it's pretty serious because it answers to a real longing that people have that liberalism is not satisfying. So liberalism begins with a premise: you're living in a diverse society, you've got to tolerate people, you're not going to agree on a lot of things. And so there's no strong form of community in liberalism. And I think that that's really what people are objecting to, because, human beings are social creatures by nature. They want to bond with other people. And in liberal society, you just get along. You don't really have any sharp moral disagreements. You want to tolerate everybody. You don't want to be judgmental. And I think people actually do want to be judgmental, and they want to have, high standards. They don't agree on those standards, but, I think that that's what they're objecting to. And therefore, they want to posit a society, with strong gods, with powerful moral imperatives.
Yes.
And those can be either on the right or on the left.
There's a few different factions in this post-liberal element of the new right that's come about. We have Catholics, anarcho-capitalists, monarchists. Which of these groups do you think is the most influential?
Well, I don't know that there's any one. I mean, the Catholic integralists, I think, are hopeless, because they're presuming that somehow we're all going to agree on some conservative version of Catholicism, which is kind of ridiculous. I think the people like Curtis Yarvin that claim to be monarchists are just kidding themselves. I mean, I think it's something said to be outrageous, because it's so contrary to everything in the American tradition that, who's really going to follow that? I think that, the more serious people are people that really want to reimpose some kind of moral hierarchy and don't really accept, the liberal view that everybody's equal. But again, there's no agreement on, what that new class structure looks like.
I've heard you describe American conservatives as Lockean liberals. What changed in American conservatism?
Well, this was a traditional way of understanding, Ronald Reagan type conservatives. So John Locke is kind of the founding father of Anglo-Saxon conservatism. Everybody's out there as an individual in the state of nature, and then they come together, they sign a social contract that allows them to live peacefully, under certain rules with one another. But there's no strong prior community. There's no kind of overarching set of values except for, liberal values. And I think that, what we associate with the Reagan years, flows from that. Very strong property rights, very strong individualism, kind of defense of, your own sphere of autonomy, that sort of thing. So I think and the property part is really important. I mean, that's really what distinguishes Locke, because he says anything you mix your labor with is your property.
Right.
And I think that was a big insight, because that, creation of private property is what makes for modern economics. And that's why liberal societies got rich very early on. So that economic dimension, I think, is important to Lockean liberalism.
For Locke, if I recall correctly, he's talking about mixing your labor with the land, particularly in
well, he says the
hereditary
useless things
passive.
of nature. He's not
The useless things of
he's not an
nature.
environmentalist.
Yeah.
He says that all these things out there, these plants and animals, actually don't have any value until human beings actually do something with them.
Sure. There's something about the conservation, the stewardship of cultivating crops, though, that proper conservation of the land.
Yeah, well, that's what it means to mix your labor with it, because, the field would be fallow unless you plow it and seed it and, so forth, right? So, and that's what produces wealth.
Is the United States headed back to early 1900s oligarchy?
It could be something worse than early 19th century. Well, I mean, because there's so much more money in the world.
Yes.
I mean, the difference between a kind of minimum wage worker and one of these tech billionaires is much larger than the difference between, J.P. Morgan and a kind of guy off the boat, in the late 19th century. And so the sheer amount of money that's available to go, and the fact that we allow as much money as anyone wants to be spent in politics, is something that gives people a degree of political power that I think, the J.P. Morgans of the 19th century didn't really exercise. Plus which, the norms are really shot now. And so the willingness of people to use their money for private purposes is, I think, much greater.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that view myself, but then there's some striking numbers in the last election that I think Kamala Harris outspent Trump, Nikki Haley outspent Trump 2-1. And so post Citizens United, the vote is still very powerful, more powerful than we had thought, potentially.
No, that's true. So I think that, you can overestimate how important money is, but it's still important,
Sure, yeah.
I mean, it creates a baseline, and it's actually a deterrent to a lot of people running that simply couldn't play in that league.
How would you propose to combat American oligarchs?
So there's a number of ways of doing it. We gave up on antitrust because of the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s and 80s. People like Robert Bork and George Stigler made this, it was an academic argument, and they have some powerful reasons for thinking that the reason that companies got really big is that they're more efficient, and therefore we should leave them alone. The trouble is that, under digital technologies that have emerged, the scale is much larger. It's much easier to reach, 1 billion people than it was, when you're making widgets, there were physical things. I mean, and so I think that the problem of oligarchy, simply changed. But you can still do things about that. I mean, there's actually this suit, antitrust suit that was started under Biden and is continuing under Trump, to break up Google. So that's one thing. You can actually force Google to divest, one of the things that Lina Khan was going after was this tendency of these big platforms to buy startups that would threaten their position.
Yes.
Is it Meta buying Instagram?
WhatsApp, so on. Yeah.
Hard to keep these things. Yeah, so that was one way that they were maintaining their position, is simply preempting competition by buying them out, so you can restrict that. You can force divestments, because a lot of the companies that these big platforms own are mutually interdependent, and they get this incredible market data, because they own, these big databases, and they can hit any market they want because they know so much about the consumers that their rivals don't have. And so there are ways that you can interfere in that ecosystem. You can simply tax people. This is Bernie Sanders' approach. The trouble is that doesn't actually yield enough revenue, not nearly as much as he thinks it would. But, you can still tax the people that got the money.
Where did woke liberalism come from?
Well, it's got a long history that people may not remember, my mentor was Alan Bloom, who in 1988 published a book called The Closing of the American Mind. And in that book, he talks about actually what was DEI back in those days. It didn't go under that particular label, but, identity politics really made its first moves in that period where people started to say, well, you don't want to teach Plato and Aristotle because they're just, white men
Right.
that, don't speak to people of color, don't speak to women, this sort of thing. And so that kind of identity politics, I think really, it was an evolution, it was a gradual evolution. You might say that it began with the 68 uprisings in Paris where old-fashioned class politics started to be replaced by identity politics, and the most prominent forms of inequality were not between worker and bourgeoisie, but now between men and women, between, heteronormative people and, gays and lesbians, this sort of thing. And that was something that really evolved really in the last couple of decades of the 20th century and then got a really, fresh start at the beginning of the 21st.
I've heard you talk about this before, but there's a even, I think, deeper origin for this, Rousseau's discourse on inequalities.
Well, you could actually go back to Martin Luther. In a certain sense, identity politics is based on this belief that there's a sharp distinction between your inner self and the outer social self that is visible to other people. And the single philosopher that talked about this the most extensively was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because he said that natural man, the inner self, was really good, was not violent, was not envious,
Yes.
was not competitive, but it was the invention of society and the moment that people started comparing themselves to other people that all the evils of the world started. And before Rousseau, basically every society said, no, the inner self is bad. The inner self is violent, selfish, and we have to impose social control on that inner self so it doesn't become destructive. With Rousseau, you flip the valence, and all of a sudden it's the inner self that's good and authentic, and it's the surrounding society that's hypocritical, that makes people do stuff that they don't believe in, and so forth. And you see this evolving in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries so that you get, basically the basis for modern identity that, and this probably comes out in sexual politics the most clearly, where you have people that are gay or lesbian, they feel that on the inside, that that's their real self, but the society is forcing them to get married, to have, pretend that they're heterosexual, and so forth. And the coming out becomes the moment of the liberation of the authentic self. So in that case, it's something real. I mean, there is an inner self that's being suppressed by society. But I think at that point, it becomes a general model where authenticity is prized for its own sake. And it also is based on a kind of Rousseauian assumption that that authentic inner self is good, and you want people to express that inner self. And that, becomes the basis for identity politics, because identity politics, tells you things like, well, I may be a Canadian citizen, but I'm really a French-speaking Quebecois, underneath, or I'm Catalan, I'm not really Spanish, that I have this inner identity that is being suppressed by politics, by society, and I want to be able to express that freely.
Well, that sounds potentially dangerous, because to reify that identity means there's an exit movement in Quebec,
Yeah.
Quebec nationalists,
Yeah.
which are, if not adjacent to or just directly neo-Nazis, white supremacist movement.
Well, yeah, that's the whole difference between Hobbes and Rousseau. I mean, Hobbes thought that inner self was pretty bad and violent, and Rousseau thought it was good and gentle. And, I think in general, Hobbes probably had the better of that argument. So releasing the inner self of everybody was not necessarily a formula for getting to a better world.
You mentioned the 68 generation, though. What influence has the 68 generation had on the American left?
It didn't have a direct effect because the United States was going through something very similar, right? You had the New Left that appeared at the time of the Vietnam War. And you had these big social movements that were triggered by big events. So the war was one thing, the rise of feminism, the rise of environmental consciousness, all of these things happened more or less simultaneously sometime during the 1960s. And that began to transform the nature of progressive ideology and thought from what it had been through most of the 20th century, where, social class defined in Marxist terms was really the way that people thought about inequality, to these newer issues. And so the American left was undergoing that same transformation, right? That people that had been wanting to be union organizers, and stick it to the man, all of a sudden became environmentalists, So that was a kind of parallel thing that was going on in Europe when they made the transition out of this hardcore, Marxism into more modern forms of progressive thought.
If that transition had not happened, might we be in a different situation today with some of these social democratic programs intact?
Well, it's interesting because Bernie Sanders is the one progressive politician that hasn't completely forgot about that older understanding of the left. He still likes just overt economic redistribution. He still thinks in class terms. He had to be kind of forced to think in terms of gender, sexual orientation. I mean, these issues did not come naturally to him. And so, there's still a part of the left. And in other parts of the world, it's much stronger. So in Latin America, for example, you have a much more classic left wing that still thinks in kind of Marxist class terms. They're beginning to make the transition to this more American style identity politics, but it hasn't, proceeded nearly as far.
What do you envision that the Democrats could offer in 2028 to defeat this Trumpism?
Good. All right, I was waiting for that
I've
question.
been working up to it.
Like I'm really all on board the abundance movement. Ezra Klein's.
I had a feeling. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been really interested in infrastructure for some years now, and it's been one of my kind of big research topics because it's really striking that we don't build stuff anymore. High-speed rail, the failure to roll out rural internet, high-speed internet. There's just a whole bunch of things that, don't happen that really ought to be happening. And I think that Ezra is right in the sense that this is actually the fault of progressives, because what progressives have done is to believe that legitimacy lies in procedures, and therefore to legitimize something you need to add more layers of procedures to the point where it gets really hard to actually do things like build transmission lines. So right now, the major producers of alternative energy in the United States are Texas and Oklahoma, these two deep red states. And the demand for that is in California, and you can't build transmission lines to get that electricity from the middle of the country to where it's needed because the permitting constraints are too great. It takes almost 10 years to get a permit for a transmission line in the United States. And so I think that if you actually want to combat Trumpism, you have to have a positive vision of what the country could look like. And the Democrats just haven't done that. They're critiquing Trump. They hate, and I do too, the authoritarian instincts that he's got and the authoritarian direction that he's taking the country. But you got to be able to say what your vision, is going to look like if you come to power. And I think there's a failure on the progressive side to appreciate that a lot of the support for Trump was driven by dislike for them. It wasn't just identity politics, but, also the fact that, blue cities, you can't do stuff, they make it too difficult. So I think that this is why just a vision where you could actually move to a low carbon future, provide a lot of jobs, and do it quickly is a very appealing, kind of vision. And I think it's something that, progressives need to embrace.
Yeah, there's something interesting that's happened where the Democrats have become so wrapped up in procedure that it emboldens the other side to say that, well, maybe we should have a CEO dictator.
Yeah,
Just
maybe
cut
we
through
should
the
get
red
rid of
tape.
all procedure. Yeah.
How did you feel about Joe Biden's spending on infrastructure?
Well, it revealed exactly what the problem is, that, he got the money appropriated through Congress, but he didn't fix the broken parts, which really were the implementation side. Obama kind of recognized that because he had an infrastructure bill, and he made this statement, there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project because there are too many regulatory requirements that have to be overcome, and the bureaucracy is too hidebound to actually implement, what Congress has mandated. So, the classic example of this is $40 billion were appropriated in
Right.
in one of Biden's bills for rural high-speed internet, and not a single household had been connected by the time he left office, right, for all of these reasons. And, he was hoping that building things under his infrastructure plan would get him a lot of votes, but almost none of those projects ever materialized. Actually, Trump is the one that's going to benefit because by the time they get through all the permitting requirements, Trump is in office and, he's going to claim credit for them.
We did it again,
Yeah,
boys.
yeah.
What do you think the critics of this say, that the 40 billion, it's still sitting there, it hasn't been tapped, so it's not like the money disappeared, but just it's waiting to be
Yeah,
greenlit?
but what do you appropriate money for? This really gets down to this really basic problem, I think, in modern liberalism. Do you actually want government for concrete things that government does, or does it just exist as a matter of procedures and we celebrate the procedures? I think most ordinary people want actual results. And so who cares whether the money is there if you don't have the high-speed internet in your home, right? And I think that that's really something that people on the left have to take much more seriously, is that you need to get to these demonstrable results that make people's lives better if you want them to vote for you. And I think there's a clear path to doing it. I think it's not just consistent with liberal or progressive principles. It's actually, it should be part of progressivism. The progressive movement in the late 19th century, the New Deal, all used government to do things. Electrify the Tennessee Valley, build the Golden Gate Bridge, build Hoover Dam. And we've kind of lost that ability to use the government to do positive things like that.
In your book, The Origins of Political Order, you focus on China as the exemplary path to modernization. Why should we focus on this example of China as opposed to Europe?
In my view, a modern government consists of three different pillars. So the first is a state, a modern, effective, impersonal state. And what I was arguing in that book was the first civilization to create such a state was China. And they did this in about the 5th century BC, so 1,800 years before the Europeans ever got there. But that's not enough. The state is just power. But if you have a state without constraint, you have a dictatorship. And so really to have a modern, I think, balanced political system, you need other institutions. So the first is a rule of law. So rule of law restricts the power of the state, so the ruler can't just do whatever the ruler wants. And then you need democracy, democratic accountability, right? So you've got a power institution, which is the state, and then two institutions of constraint, rule of law and democracy. And hopefully you'll get some kind of balance right, because if you're too far over on the state side, you've got a dictatorship. And if you're too far over on the constraint side, you've got a kind of incoherent, political system that can't actually do stuff. And I think what I argued in that book was that the Chinese got the first of these. They got the state part. So they've got a really high quality, competent state that can do all sorts of stuff, right? They decide they're going to manufacture semiconductors and robots and all that stuff, and they just do it. What they don't have is a constraint on that state. They obviously don't have democracy. They looked like they were sort of inching towards rule of law in the 1990s, but Xi Jinping just said, no, forget about it. It's all the power of the Communist Party. So they got 1/3 of the formula right, but the other 2/3, they're just, they're not at the cutting edge.
I feel like we're batting 1 for 3 ourselves right now.
Yeah, we are. Living here in California, I think we're actually at the other extreme. Like we
How
got
so?
too many constraints, and we've got a very weak state. And so this is my spectrum. It goes from China on the one side to the state of California on the other.
Francis Fukuyama, it's been fantastic talking to you. I have
Thanks.
immense admiration for your work.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon.